Hi, I'm Joe Hemmann from Springfield, Missouri, and I've been playing Living End as a modern deck since the early 2012 modern season. The reason I enjoy the deck so much is that it really can attack from a lot of different angles. It hits people unexpectedly because they assume that they can simply remove the graveyard or do something to the Living End and win. And then you just start casting guys and beat them anyway. I believe it's a good deck for the metagame because this metagame is so wide open that as long as you have a strong game plan that executes well, you have a chance. And the unexpectedness of this deck, it takes a lot of people off guard. There's plenty of people just reading cards. What does that do? Why? And then even the good players who do know what it does, they haven't tested against it much, so it still kind of takes them off guard some of the interactions, even if they recognize exactly what you're doing from turn one. As far as the deck structure, mostly the base of the combo is cascading in the Living End, and this is pretty well standard for almost every Living End list you'll ever see. 7 or some of them play 8 Cascaders and 3 copies of Living End. Obviously, when you cast a Cascade spell, there's nothing else that can hit besides Living End, so you cast it on, usually try to hit it on turn 3. A lot of times it won't have counter magic ready, and hopefully you cycle 2 or 3 guys by then, and you just overwhelm them with an early board position. The cascading package, the cycling package for this deck, this is a little bit off standard. A lot of people are not playing Architects of Will, and they are playing at least a couple copies of Jungle Weaver and or Land Cyclers. I don't like not being able to cycle 2 at a time in the early game, the first couple turns, and then in the later game, if I'm going to cycle and cascade on the same turn, which happens all the time, that also makes I have to get up to 5 mana to do that. So I just prefer to keep it all at the 1 mana cyclers, and these are the only good 1 mana cyclers that you can actually cycle with the mana base of the deck. And Architects of Will ability is actually not irrelevant. Reordering their deck right after you have a pretty insurmountable board state anyway, if you reorder the top 3 cards of their deck, you bury the sweeper that they might have been able to regain control with. The LD package is becoming fairly common. 3 Avalanche Rider, 4 Fulminator Mage, pretty well standard. You might see a different number of Avalanche Riders and some people that don't play them at all. But 4 Fulminator Mage is what makes this deck tick. Everybody's mana bases has targets for it, and being able to blow up a land and then cascade and blow up another land just puts them off of their game for plenty long for you to run them over with your board state. I take it to a little bit more of an extreme with the Beast Withins as well. I tend to blow up lands with Beast Within because that just leaves them at 1 or 2 lands at most, and post Living End, half the time they have no mana left, and the game is pretty well sewn up after that. The main deck LD package really helps you against things like Tron. You can run them over pretty easily most of the time. Red-green Tron's a little bit harder because they play so many ways to fetch the Tron pieces that even if you keep blowing them up, they might still be able to recover, which is why Sidene Spirit Guide is so important, because if you're on the play, rushing out the Fulminator Mage on your turn 2 can keep them from cracking their expedition maps. That you can just keep them at 0 for a few turns, and they don't play enough land to naturally draw out of that most of the time. They end up just sitting there for a few turns until you Living End, and they don't counter your Living End anyway, so the matchup gets pretty easy after that. What you might call the utility creatures in the deck, you'll see lists playing all sorts of different things here. Some people like main decking Ingot Chewers because, again, problem artifacts might be a problem in the metagame, so they just blow them up. You'll see people with main deck Fairy Macabre in case people have stuff that ends up going to the graveyard. I don't think there's enough decks that will have creatures in the graveyard when you go off that it's really a problem. So I'm sticking with, especially in this aggro-heavy metagame, I'm sticking with 3 Spike Feeders for life gain. Double green is not hard for the deck to get to. Some people play Brindlebore, but it's just as good as Brindlebore, and has the added flexibility of making Street Wraith or Monstrous Carabid big enough to eat a post-Living End Tarmogoyf that they drop on you. Sidene Spirit Guide is also a debated point in the deck, but a lot of the counter-based control decks, being able to hurry out a Fulminator Mage or an Avalanche Rider a turn earlier can really put them off their game before they actually get going. As far as the mana base of the deck is concerned, I mean, it kind of looks a little weird with all the scars duels and just a few shocks and 6 fetch lands, just a couple basics. But this configuration of mana just seems to make the deck hum just about perfectly. The only thing I am considering, I had 2 swamps and a forest. I added another forest in, and I might shift from 3 black cleave cliffs and 2 copper line over to 3 copper line and 2 black cleave cliffs because of my recent change over to spike feeder and that double green requirement. But other than that, the singleton utility land you'll see in most living in lists, and Kessig Wolf Run seems to be where most people are going. I like it. It stops random chump blocks, especially if you have to go off early and just have a couple guys on the board and they might have chump blocks for a while. It stops that from actually being a viable game plan for them. You can just run over the chumps and beat them a lot faster. It sews up games that would otherwise be annoying. There are some people playing man lands in that slot, but whenever you don't have much of a board presence until post living end, then they're probably banking removal anyway. And if you activate your Raging Ravine for 4 mana, you're going to look pretty silly when they lightning bolt it. The sideboard is where I address graveyard hate for the most part, because most graveyard hate getting played is still in the form of artifacts. So I start with Ingot Truers. Honestly, in order to deal with graveyard hate, you would really only need maybe 2 or 3 Ingot Chewers, and I'm playing all 4. That's really because Affinity still exists in the environment, and he's just about the best creature this deck can have against Affinity. He blows up, for a single mana, he blows up Cranial Platings in the early game, and then when you living in, he blows up, if they have an Arcbound Ravager and can sack their whole board, Ingot Chewer can immediately destroy their board again the moment the living in actually goes off. Fairy Macabre is in for that kind of matchup as well. Affinity, Martyr, Pod, anything that has sacrifice effects, and especially anything that operates out of the graveyard. Blue-White Tron trying to reanimate Iona. Or any other just deck that lives out of reanimating guys out of their graveyard. The Ricochet traps are in there, obviously, for counter magic. They're about just the best way to deal with counter magic. You don't cascade into them. It's also really fun against Twin. I have actually had cases where they will cast a Splinter Twin with tapping out to do it, thinking that I have no way of countering it, and then I'll steal the Twin and put it on one of my guys. It's really fun if you have an Avalanche Rider or a Fulminator base to do that, but even if you don't, just having a response to their Twin that involves then getting value out of it is pretty potent in that matchup. The Dismembers are really in there for, well, they also go in against Twin just because having another instant speed way of disrupting their combo can be pretty important. They're also in for any list that plays, some large creature that they could easily follow up a living end with that creature, especially Tarmogoyf is around a lot. Sometimes in the early, if you're forced to go off kind of early and you don't have a great board state, then a follow-up Tarmogoyf can just spell doom for you because it's bigger than all your guys and you're just not going to be able to push enough damage before the Tarmogoyf eats through your team. The last couple pieces of extra life gain, the 4th Spike Feeder and the Brindlebore, they're kind of just a metagame choice. Right now the amount of aggro running around causes me to want to be able to have 5 cards that I can gain life with and as quickly as possible, especially for things like Turn and Burn or Rakdos Boros lists that just come out the gate really fast. Even 5-color Zoo, that type of thing. The deck's weakest matchups, I would say, as I mentioned, fast aggro. Affinity is really hard because even if you do blow ups their key pieces, every random creature in the deck is a big threat if they get another Cranial Plating, and they can play multiple ways to mess with the graveyard. Now, I haven't seen a ton of graveyard hate out of them lately, but red, white, blue mid-range, things that play Rest in Peace as a graveyard hit can be hard as well. I did beat a red, white, blue control deck in St. Louis that played a turn 2 Rest in Peace on me, and I never got it removed. I never saw a Beast Within. And that brings up another strength of this deck, is that even if they take away the living end, you can draw so many cards that you'll get to enough land to just start hard casting the guys. And although they're only 3/4s and 4/4s, and they're bad at being that because they cost 5 mana, at the end of the day, they're just as big as everybody else's creatures, and you just keep coming because you're playing 16, 20, 23, playing 26 of them. And the graveyard hate, people also forget that even if you have no graveyard, you can always use Living End as a Wrath if you're playing against an aggro deck. As far as the Rug Delver matchup that beat me twice in Kansas City, the Swiss loss of that was I wasn't familiar enough with the deck, and I thought it was more mid-range, so I didn't resolve a very early Living End when I had a window, because I thought if I resolved it that quickly, he was going to follow up with more guys. I didn't realize how creature-light the deck was, and had I resolved it in the first couple turns, I probably would have beat him. Because I misread that, he ended up just playing Delver turn 1, Tarmogoyf turn 2, and then sitting on counter magic the rest of the game and beating me down. That's valid. It can be played around. You can hit him with the end of turn Violent Outburst into your turn Demonic Dread, because you got 7 of those cards you're cycling into him. That happens plenty of times, but it does get a little difficult. But I made that mistake actually both games in Swiss, because the first game ended quickly enough that I still wasn't sure he wasn't a mid-range deck. In game 2, I didn't really adjust my play, and he beat the top 8 though. I beat him in game 1 because I did exactly that. I cycled quickly and played a turn 2 accelerated Violent Outburst off of the Summoning Spirit Guide with just a Carabid and a Street Wraith in my yard, and he could not deal with the 4/4 and 3/4 after I killed a Delver and a Tarn. But game 2, he squeaked through. And then in game 3, I gave him too much respect for Spell Pierce that he didn't have. I just couldn't get him down to no land. I kept blowing up lands. I had him at 1, but he always had 1 blue up, and I got a little light on the mana that game, and didn't get to the point where I could cascade and pay for the Spell Pierce. I made him play a mistake in blowing up one of his lands with a Beast Within, probably a little early. And although it did keep him off mana, it gave him a lot faster clock because he never did flip his Delver, so he would have only been swinging for 1 a turn, and then I allowed him to swing for 4.